Billionaire shocked when his maid's toddler did something unexpected for an injured pigeon. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. Not on a quiet Tuesday morning, not in the middle of his own garden, not because of a bird. Nathaniel Cross had built an empire out of control over numbers, over people, over every outcome he could touch. But nothing prepares a man for the moment a 3-year-old girl in a blue dress makes him feel something he buried a long, long time ago. What she did next would break him open in front of his entire staff. And he never saw it coming. Hey, before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your country down in the comments. I always love reading where you all are tuning in from. Today's story is one of those quiet, heart-tugging ones about a busy, guarded young billionaire, a little girl who wasn't even supposed to be in his garden that morning, and an injured bird that somehow became the reason his whole world cracked open. Stay with me till the end, because where this goes, you really won't expect it. Section 1. The sprinklers hadn't even finished their morning cycle when Elena Ramirez rushed through the side gate of the Cross estate, one hand gripping her daughter's wrist, the other clutching her purse like it might fall apart along with the rest of her morning. "Sophia, baby, please, just sit quietly in the kitchen today, okay? Mommy has so much work." Sophia, 3 years old, dressed, against all logic, in the pale blue tulle dress she'd insisted on wearing since her cousin's birthday party the weekend before, nodded without really listening. She was too busy staring at the fountain in the distance, the one that sprayed little rainbows when the sun hit it just right. Elena hadn't planned on bringing her daughter to work. But her sitter had canceled at 6 in the morning, her sister was out of town, and the Cross estate needed its Tuesday deep clean whether Elena had childcare or not. She'd made the calculation every working mother eventually makes. Better to break a small rule quietly than lose a job she couldn't afford to lose. Nathaniel Cross was not, by nature, an unreasonable employer. He paid well. He didn't yell. But he also didn't tolerate distractions, and children, in his mind, formed from a childhood he rarely spoke of, were the definition of distraction. His housekeeper, Marta, had warned Elena more than once, "Mr. Cross doesn't like surprises on the property. Especially not before 9 a.m. So Elena did what any mother in her position would do. She found the quietest corner of the estate, the far end of the garden, past the rose hedges, near the old stone fountain, and set Sophia down with a juice box and a coloring book, praying the little girl would stay put for the 2 hours it would take to finish the West Wing. "Stay right here, mi amor. Don't wander, okay?" Sophia nodded again, already distracted by a ladybug crawling along the hem of her dress. For the first 20 minutes, it worked. Sophia colored. She hummed a song from her favorite cartoon. She watched the water catch the light. And then she saw it, a small, gray shape at the base of the fountain, wings folded wrong, one leg tucked strangely beneath its body. A pigeon. Injured. Not moving much, just a slow, labored blink, its chest rising and falling too fast. Most adults would have walked past it. Most 3-year-olds would have been scared of it, or ignored it entirely in favor of the coloring book. But Sophia set her crayon down without a word, stood up in her too big princess dress, and walked toward the bird the way children walk toward things they don't yet know to be afraid of, with pure, uncomplicated curiosity. "Hi, Birdie," she whispered, crouching down slowly, the way she'd seen her mother crouch when talking to frightened animals at the shelter they sometimes passed on the bus. "Are you okay?" The pigeon didn't fly away. It couldn't. And something about that, about the bird's stillness, its quiet suffering in a garden full of manicured perfection, settled into Sophia's small chest like a stone. She didn't call for her mother. She didn't cry. She simply looked around, spotted the neatly folded white hand towels stacked near the pool house for guests, and made a decision no one had taught her to make. She would help. What she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that 50 feet away, behind the tall windows of his study, Nathaniel Cross had just looked up from his laptop and out into the garden, and frozen at the sight of a small child he did not recognize, kneeling in the grass, reaching toward something on the ground. His first instinct was irritation. His second instinct, the one that would end up changing everything, was to keep watching. Section 2. Nathaniel stood at the window longer than he meant to. He told himself he was simply assessing a security concern. An unfamiliar child on his property was, by any reasonable standard, worth investigating. That was the story he told himself as he set down his coffee, adjusted his blazer out of habit rather than necessity, and walked out through the side doors into the garden. But some quieter part of him, a part he rarely acknowledged, was curious about something else entirely. About the stillness in the way the child moved. About how careful she was being with whatever it was she'd found. By the time he crossed the lawn, Sophia had already retrieved one of the folded hand towels from the pool house rack, dragging it across the grass because it was nearly as big as she was, and was attempting, with great seriousness, to lay it flat beside the fountain. "Excuse me," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying the clipped authority he used in boardrooms. "What are you doing?" Sophia looked up at him without flinching, the way small children often do with strangers who haven't yet given them a reason to be afraid. "The birdie's hurt," she said simply, pointing at the pigeon. "I'm helping." Nathaniel's eyes moved from the child to the bird and back again, his jaw tightening. A pigeon. A pest, in his mind the kind his groundskeepers were paid to keep off the property. The kind that left droppings on his stone pathways and nested in gutters he'd had to replace twice last year. And now there was a strange child using his $400 Egyptian cotton towels as a makeshift infirmary bed for one. "That's not," he started, then stopped, unsure exactly what he meant to say. "That's not appropriate? That's not sanitary? That's not your towel to ruin?" Before he could finish the thought, Elena came sprinting around the hedge, her face pale with panic. "Sophia." "Oh my God, I am so sorry, Mr. Cross. I told her to stay by the fountain. I didn't think she'd—" "Sophia, baby, come here right now." "It's fine," Nathaniel said automatically, though his tone suggested it was very much not fine. "I'll have someone deal with the bird. You should get back to your work." Elena reached for her daughter's hand, already murmuring apologies, already bracing. Nathaniel could see it in her shoulders for the possibility that this small, harmless moment might cost her the job she needed. But Sophia didn't move. She looked up at the tall man in the sharp pink suit, a color choice that, in another moment, might have amused her, might have made her ask why a grown-up was wearing her favorite color, and she said something that stopped both adults cold. "He's scared. You gotta be soft." It wasn't defiance. It wasn't a performance for the adults around her. It was simply true, spoken the way children speak truth, without calculation, without fear of consequence. Nathaniel opened his mouth to respond, to say something about property, about propriety, about the dozen meetings waiting for him inside. But nothing came out. Because for reasons he could not immediately explain, even to himself, the words "you gotta be soft" had landed somewhere deep and old inside his chest, somewhere he kept very carefully locked. "Sophia, we need to go," Elena said again, gently pulling her daughter back. "Wait," Nathaniel said. Both Elena and Sophia turned to look at him, surprised by the word, by the sudden shift in his voice. "Let her finish," he said quietly. I'll get some water. And something we can use as a splint." Elena blinked at him, certain for a moment she'd misheard. Marta, who had come out onto the porch to see what the commotion was, blinked too. In 4 years of employment on this estate, no one had ever seen Nathaniel Cross kneel down in the grass in a $5,000 suit. But that's precisely what he did next, lowering himself onto the lawn beside a 3-year-old and an injured pigeon, uncertain, for perhaps the first time in a decade, of what he was doing or why. Section 3. The truth, though no one on that lawn knew it yet, went back 21 years. Nathaniel had been 7 years old, living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in a part of the city his current address would never require him to think about again. His mother, Diane Cross, had cleaned houses for a living much like Elena did now, though Nathaniel had spent years making sure no one connected those dots, had spent years constructing a version of himself so polished, so self-made, that the truth of where he came from felt like something to bury rather than remember. Diane had a habit that used to embarrass him as a child and that he now, kneeling in his own garden, understood he had never actually forgotten. She could not walk past an injured animal. Not a stray cat. Not a bird with a broken wing. Not once. She'd bring them home in shoeboxes, feed them with an eyedropper, nurse them back to health on their kitchen table while Nathaniel did his homework beside her, rolling his eyes the way kids do at their parents' soft-heartedness. "Why do you bother, Mom? It's just a bird." "Because nobody else will, Mijo. And because you never know," she used to say, "what a little bit of kindness is gonna turn into." She died when he was 11. Sudden, fast, the kind of loss that doesn't give a child time to prepare, an illness that had gone undiagnosed for too long because she couldn't afford the doctor's visits that might have caught it early. Nathaniel had been shuffled between relatives for 2 years afterward, angry and grieving in a way no one around him knew how to address, until a great-uncle he'd barely known took him in and, more importantly, left him a small inheritance and a stern insistence on education that Nathaniel had turned, through sheer relentless will, into an empire. He had built Cross Innovations from a garage apartment and a single patent into a company worth more than some small country's economies. He had done it by being cold when coldness was required, ruthless when ruthlessness closed the deal, and utterly, completely unsentimental about anything that didn't serve a measurable purpose. An injured pigeon served no measurable purpose. And yet here he was, on his knees in the grass, watching a 3-year-old gently press a damp towel against a wing she didn't fully understand was fractured, saying, "It's okay, Birdie, it's okay," in the exact soft, certain tone his mother used to use. 21 years and a lifetime away. "Mr. Cross." Elena's voice cut through the memory. She was still standing a few feet back, unsure whether to intervene, unsure whether her employer, a man she'd worked for 8 months and had exchanged maybe 40 words with total, was having some kind of breakdown in his own garden. Nathaniel realized his hands were shaking slightly. He pressed them flat against his knees to stop it. "I had a mother who did this," he said, so quietly that Elena almost didn't catch it. "Birds. Cats. Anything hurt that crossed her path. She used to say the same thing your daughter just said." He glanced at Sophia, who was utterly absorbed in her task, oblivious to the emotional avalanche she'd triggered in the man beside her. "You gotta be soft." Elena didn't know what to say. In 8 months, Nathaniel Cross had never once mentioned a parent, a childhood, a single detail of a life before the one splashed across business magazines. "She sounds like she was a wonderful woman," Elena offered carefully. "She was," Nathaniel said. And then, because the words seemed to come from somewhere he hadn't visited in years, he added, "She would have hated the man I turned into." The silence that followed said more than either of them could have put into words. Sophia, unaware of the weight settling over the 2 adults above her, looked up brightly and held out the pigeon, now wrapped snugly in a hand towel, its small head poking out, blinking slowly. "I fixed him," she announced proudly. "Can we keep him?" Section 4. "We are not keeping a pigeon, Sophia," Elena said, though her voice had softened considerably, the panic of 20 minutes ago giving way to something gentler as she watched her daughter's small, determined face. "But he needs us," Sophia insisted, hugging the bundle a little closer. Nathaniel found himself, against every instinct that had governed his life for the past 2 decades, agreeing with the toddler. "She's right that he needs help. That leg looks broken, not just bruised. He'll need a vet and probably a few weeks of care before he can be released." Marta, still watching from the porch, finally found her voice. "Should I call pest control, sir? They handle wildlife removal too." "No," Nathaniel said, more sharply than he intended. He softened it immediately. "No. Call Dr. Whitfield instead. The exotic animal vet I used for the horses last year. Tell her it's urgent." Marta's eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly, a $50,000 veterinary specialist summoned for a common city pigeon, but she nodded and disappeared back into the house without argument. In 8 years of employment, she had learned not to question Nathaniel Cross's decisions, only to marvel, occasionally, at which ones surprised her. This one surprised her considerably. Elena crouched down beside her daughter, torn between relief that she hadn't lost her job and bewilderment at the direction the morning had taken. "Sophia, honey, say thank you to Mr. Cross." "Thank you," Sophia said dutifully, then immediately returned her full attention to the pigeon, whispering reassurances to it in the private, nonsensical language small children reserve for creatures they've decided to love. Nathaniel stood, brushing grass from his trousers, aware that his knees were damp and that he did not, in this moment, care even slightly. He looked down at Elena. "How long have you worked here?" 8 months, sir. And in 8 months I don't think we've spoken more than a handful of times. Elena shifted uncomfortably. "You're a busy man. I try to stay out of your way." "That's not," he paused, reconsidering. "I don't think that's a compliment to either of us." Elena wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she said nothing, watching instead as her daughter carefully repositioned the towel around the pigeon's wing, murmuring encouragement. "She's remarkable," Nathaniel said, nodding toward Sophia. "Most adults wouldn't have stopped." "She's always been like this," Elena said, a small, tired smile crossing her face, the first genuine one Nathaniel had seen from her. "Ever since she could walk, she's been trying to save things. Bugs. Worms on the sidewalk after it rains. Once she cried for an hour because I wouldn't let her bring a squirrel with a limp into our apartment." Nathaniel almost laughed, an unfamiliar sound, one that surprised even him as it left his throat. "My mother was the same way." Elena studied him for a moment, something shifting in her expression, not quite understanding, but the beginning of it. "You don't talk about your mother much. Marta mentioned once that you never do." "There's not much to talk about," Nathaniel said, the old defense rising automatically. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. There was everything to talk about. He simply hadn't allowed himself to, not in years, not since he'd learned that grief was inefficient, that sentiment didn't build companies, that the fastest way through pain was around it entirely. Watching Sophia now, though, her total, uncomplicated devotion to a creature that offered her nothing in return, no profit, no advantage, nothing but the simple fact of its suffering, something in that carefully constructed avoidance began, quietly, to crack. Section 5. Dr. Whitfield arrived within the hour, her mobile veterinary van pulling through the estate's front gate with the kind of quiet efficiency Nathaniel usually appreciated in his staff and, in this particular moment, found himself grateful for in an entirely different way. She examined the pigeon on a portable table set up on the garden lawn, Sophia standing on tiptoe beside her, peppering the vet with the kind of relentless 3-year-old questions that would have exhausted anyone without endless patience. "Is he gonna be okay? Does it hurt? Can birds cry? Why is his leg like that?" Dr. Whitfield, to her credit, answered every single one with genuine warmth. "His leg is fractured, sweetheart, but it's a clean break. If we splint it and keep him calm for a few weeks, he should heal up just fine." "You did a really good job keeping him calm and comfortable. That actually helps a lot." Sophia beamed like she'd just been told she'd saved the world, which, in her 3-year-old understanding of things, she more or less had. Nathaniel stood a short distance away, watching the scene with an expression Elena hadn't seen on him before, something unguarded, something almost boyish, the corporate armor momentarily set aside. "You could have just called pest control," Elena said quietly, coming to stand beside him as the vet worked. "It would have been faster. Cheaper. Nobody would have questioned it." "I know," Nathaniel said. "So why didn't you?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching Sophia hold perfectly still so as not to startle the bird while Dr. Whitfield wrapped a tiny splint around its leg with practiced hands. "Because I watched a 3-year-old do something I haven't done in 20 years, he finally said. She saw something small and broken, and instead of walking past it, or deciding it wasn't worth the trouble, she just helped. No calculation. No cost-benefit analysis. She just helped because it needed help. That's just how kids are," Elena said gently. "Before the world teaches them not to be." "My mother never stopped being like that," Nathaniel said. "Not even when we had nothing. Especially not then, actually. I used to think it was foolish. Sentimental. A waste of energy she didn't have to spare." He paused, watching Sophia stroke the pigeon's head with one careful finger. I built my entire life avoiding being foolish like that. Avoiding being soft, like your daughter said. I thought that's what made me successful. And now? Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. Dr. Whitfield was finishing the splint, showing Sophia how to hold the bird securely without hurting it, and something about the tenderness of the scene, the vulnerability of it, the total absence of strategy or self-interest, made the words catch in his throat. Now I'm wondering what it cost me, he said finally. To become someone who has to be reminded, by a toddler, that broken things are worth stopping for. Elena didn't know what to say to that. It wasn't the kind of thing employers said to their household staff, and it certainly wasn't the kind of thing Nathaniel Cross, according to every profile ever written about him, was supposed to be capable of saying. But standing there in the garden, watching her daughter's small hands cradle something fragile with total confidence, Elena found herself, for the first time in 8 months, seeing her employer as something other than a distant, formidable name on a paycheck. She saw, instead, a man who had spent a very long time forgetting something important, and who had just been reminded of it by accident. Section 6. Dr. Whitfield named the pigeon Biscuit Sophia's suggestion, delivered with the absolute conviction only a 3-year-old can muster, and set up a small recovery enclosure in what had once been an unused garden shed near the pool house. She gave detailed instructions, minimal handling for the first week, a specific feeding schedule, a follow-up visit in 10 days. He'll need someone to check on him daily, she said, packing up her equipment. Keep him calm, keep him fed, make sure the splint stays in place. Nathaniel, without entirely meaning to, found himself volunteering. I'll handle it. Marta, still hovering nearby with the particular alertness of someone documenting an unprecedented event, raised an eyebrow so high it nearly disappeared into her hairline. In 8 years, she had never once seen Nathaniel Cross commit to a daily task that didn't involve a boardroom, a spreadsheet, or a multi-million-dollar acquisition. Sir, your schedule this week includes the Tokyo call at 6 a.m., the board meeting at 9, I'm aware of my schedule, Marta, Nathaniel said, though not unkindly. I can manage feeding a pigeon. Sophia, delighted by this development, insisted on giving Nathaniel a full tutorial on pigeon care, most of which she had invented on the spot, but delivered with such earnestness that Nathaniel found himself nodding along seriously, as though receiving instructions from a colleague rather than a 3-year-old in a princess dress. You gotta talk to him soft, she instructed. And don't make loud noises. And he likes when you sing. He likes when you sing? Everybody likes singing, Sophia said, as though this were simply an established fact of the universe, requiring no further explanation. Over the following days, something shifted in the rhythm of the Cross estate that no one, least of all Nathaniel himself, could have predicted. Each morning, before his 6 a.m. calls, he would walk out to the shed and check on Biscuit, refilling water, ensuring the makeshift heat lamp was functioning, occasionally, when he was certain no one was watching. Humming something under his breath that he hadn't realized he still remembered, a lullaby his mother used to sing while cooking dinner in their cramped kitchen, back when their whole world was a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. Elena noticed the change first, though she said nothing about it for several days, unsure whether commenting on her employer's altered demeanor crossed some invisible professional line. But it was hard not to notice. He lingered in the kitchen sometimes now, asking Marta about her grandchildren. He'd started saying good morning to the household staff by name, something he'd never done before, not out of malice, but simply because he'd never thought to. He asked Sophia, with genuine curiosity rather than obligation, about her day, her cartoons, her opinions on the correct way to eat a peanut butter sandwich. You've been different this week, Elena finally said, on the 5th day, as she found him crouched by Biscuit's enclosure, gently checking the bird's splint the way Dr. Whitfield had shown him. Nathaniel didn't look up right away. I've been thinking about my mother more this week than I have in years, he admitted. I used to be so ashamed of where we came from, of how little we had. I spent my whole adult life trying to become someone who'd never have to think about a leaking roof or a landlord's eviction notice again. And you did, Elena said. You built all of this. I did, he agreed, gesturing vaguely at the estate around them, the fountain, the gardens, the mansion rising behind it all. But somewhere along the way, I think I also built a version of myself my mother wouldn't recognize. A man who'd have called pest control on a hurt bird without a second thought. A man who barely knew the names of the people working in his own home. Elena was quiet for a moment. You know her name now, she offered gently. Mine, I mean. And Sophia's. That's not nothing. Nathaniel looked up at her, something like gratitude in his expression. It's a start, he said. I'd like it to be more than that. Section 7. The change didn't go unnoticed outside the estate walls either. Nathaniel Cross's business associates began to comment on it in ways that ranged from bemused to openly suspicious. His longtime business partner, Richard Alden, cornered him after the Thursday board meeting, arms crossed, studying Nathaniel with the wary expression of a man trying to diagnose an illness in a colleague he'd known for a decade. You've been late to 2 calls this week, Richard said. You? Late? In 10 years, I don't think you've been late to anything. I had a commitment, Nathaniel said simply. A commitment. To what exactly? Nathaniel hesitated, weighing how much of this he wanted to explain to a man who measured most things in quarterly earnings. A pigeon, he finally said. It's a long story. Richard blinked. A pigeon. It's recovering from a broken leg. It needs feeding twice a day. Nathaniel, you run a $9 billion company. You could hire someone to feed a pigeon. I know, Nathaniel said. And he did know, could have delegated the task in 30 seconds, could have forgotten about the entire incident within the hour if he'd chosen to. But something about doing it himself, about the small, undramatic ritual of checking on something helpless and watching it slowly heal because of consistent, unglamorous care, had become important to him in a way he wasn't entirely able to articulate to a man like Richard. Is everything all right with you? Richard asked, and for once, the question sounded genuinely concerned rather than merely strategic. Nathaniel considered the question seriously. I think, he said slowly, everything might be more all right than it's been in a very long time. That evening, back at the estate, Nathaniel found himself standing outside the kitchen, watching Elena help Sophia with her dinner while Marta bustled around preparing the household's evening routine. He watched the easy warmth between mother and daughter, the small rituals of an ordinary family evening he'd never had much exposure to, not since he was 11 years old and his own mother's kitchen had gone permanently silent. He knocked lightly on the doorframe, feeling, absurdly, like a guest in his own home. Would it be all right, he asked Elena, if I joined you both for dinner? Just tonight. Elena looked up, startled. Household staff and employer did not, as a rule, share meals. The boundary was clear, unspoken, understood by everyone in the house. But something in Nathaniel's expression, a kind of quiet, unguarded hope she hadn't seen from him before, made her set the rule aside. Of course, she said. Sophia would love that. Wouldn't you, baby? Sophia, mouth already full of macaroni, nodded enthusiastically and patted the empty chair beside her with great authority. You can sit here. Next to me and Biscuit's picture. Indeed, taped crookedly to the wall beside the table was a crayon drawing Sophia's rendition of the pigeon, rendered in confident purple and orange, with wings considerably larger than any real pigeon possessed and a smile that pigeons, biologically, are not capable of producing. Nathaniel sat. And for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, dinner in his own home felt less like a solitary obligation and more like something worth looking forward to. Section 8. 10 days after Biscuit's rescue, Dr. Whitfield returned for the follow-up examination, and the news was good. The fracture had healed cleanly, the splint could come off, and within a week or two, the pigeon would be ready for release back into the wild. Sophia's reaction to this news was, predictably, complicated. But he's my friend, she said, lower lip trembling dangerously as Dr. Whitfield explained the timeline. He can't leave. Elena crouched down to her daughter's level, brushing a curl from her forehead. Sweetheart, Biscuit isn't like a pet. He's a wild bird. He has a whole world out there, a family, friends, a life he's supposed to be living. We helped him because he needed us for a little while. But keeping him here forever in a cage wouldn't be kind. It would just be different kind of hurt. Sophia considered this with the intense seriousness 3-year-olds reserve for genuinely difficult concepts. Like, letting him go is the soft thing to do? Even though it makes me sad? Elena's breath caught slightly at her daughter's understanding, so simple and so precisely correct. Exactly like that, baby. Sometimes loving something means letting it go, even when it hurts. Nathaniel, standing nearby, felt those words land somewhere unexpectedly deep. He thought of his mother, of the version of himself he'd spent 2 decades constructing in her absence, a man who'd built walls instead of processing grief, who'd equated softness with weakness for so long he'd nearly forgotten the difference between strength and armor. He thought, too, of what it might mean to finally let go of some of that armor himself. That night, after Sophia had gone to bed and Elena was preparing to head home for the evening, Nathaniel found her in the kitchen, gathering her things. "I wanted to say something," he said, "and I'm not entirely sure how to say it well, so I hope you'll forgive me if it comes out clumsy." Elena paused, giving him her full attention. "These past 10 days, Nathaniel continued, your daughter has taught me more about the kind of man I want to be than any board meeting, any acquisition, any success I've built in the last decade. I'd stopped believing that kindness and strength could coexist. I'd convinced myself that softness was something you had to sacrifice to succeed." He paused, searching for the right words. Watching both of you, honestly, I don't believe that anymore." Elena felt something warm rise in her chest, though she wasn't entirely sure how to respond to such an unguarded admission from a man who, less than 2 weeks ago, had felt entirely unreachable. "She'd be glad to hear that," Elena said softly. "Though I think she'd tell you it was Biscuit who taught you, not her." Nathaniel smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. "Maybe it was both of them," he said. "Maybe it took a broken bird and an honest little girl to remind a very stubborn man of something he should never have let himself forget." Section 9. The following week, Nathaniel did something that surprised everyone on his executive team, including Richard, who had grown accustomed over the past 10 days to a version of his business partner he barely recognized. He announced the launch of the Diane Cross Foundation, named, unmistakably, after his mother, dedicated to supporting working single parents, with an initial focus on emergency childcare grants, so that mothers like Elena would never again have to choose between a shift they couldn't afford to lose and a childcare gap they had no way to fill. "You want to name a multi-million-dollar foundation after a housekeeper?" Richard asked, not unkindly, but with the careful tone of a man trying to understand a decision that made no sense on a balance sheet. "She wasn't just a housekeeper," Nathaniel said. "She was the reason I know what it means to be soft and strong at the same time. I spent 20 years trying to forget that lesson. I'd like to spend the next 20 making sure other people's kids don't have to learn it the hard way I did." The foundation's first grant recipient, announced quietly and without fanfare, was Elena Ramirez, enough funding to cover a full year of reliable, high-quality childcare for Sophia, along with a modest scholarship fund that would, years down the line, help pay for whatever school the girl chose to attend, whatever path her fierce, tender heart decided to pursue. Elena wept when she found out, standing in the kitchen with the letter in her trembling hands, Sophia tugging at her sleeve, confused by her mother's tears, but instinctively wrapping her small arms around Elena's legs in a gesture of comfort. "You didn't have to do this," Elena said later, finding Nathaniel in the garden, near the shed where Biscuit was completing his final days of recovery. "I know," Nathaniel said. "That's rather the point, isn't it? The best things anyone's ever done for me were the things they didn't have to do." Biscuit, meanwhile, had grown restless in his enclosure, hopping along his perch with the particular energy of a creature that knows, on some instinctive level, that it's nearly time to fly again. Dr. Whitfield had cleared him for release that very morning, the splint long gone, the leg healed clean and strong. "Today's the day," Nathaniel told Sophia, who had come running out in yet another princess dress, pink this time, though her devotion to the color blue remained. Elena assured him, absolute and undiminished in general. Sophia's face went through a complicated series of emotions, excitement, sadness, pride, and finally, a kind of brave acceptance that made both adults watching her feel, in their own separate ways, a little more hopeful about the world. "Can I say bye?" she asked. "Of course," Nathaniel said, opening the enclosure gently. "He'd want you to." Section 10. They gathered in the garden that evening, Nathaniel, Elena, Sophia, Marta, even Dr. Whitfield, who had returned specifically to witness the release she'd made possible. Sophia held Biscuit one final time, cradling him with the same careful confidence she'd shown 11 days earlier, when a stranger's injured pigeon had, without either of them realizing it, begun quietly rewriting the future of everyone in that garden. "You're gonna be okay now," she whispered to him, her small voice carrying an authority that seemed, somehow, entirely earned. "You gotta fly good and eat good and find your bird family." "Okay." She kissed the top of his head, a gesture that made Elena's eyes sting all over again, and then, with a gentle upward motion, released him into the open air. For a moment, Biscuit simply sat on her open palms, as though hesitant to leave the small, warm world that had cared for him so completely. And then, in one smooth motion, wings that had been broken and were now whole again caught the evening air, and he rose, first low over the fountain, then higher, over the rose hedges, over the estate's stone walls, until he was nothing but a small dark shape disappearing into a sky turning gold with sunset. Sophia watched him go with her hand shading her eyes, unable to hide the tears gathering there, but smiling through them anyway, the particular, complicated joy of having loved something well enough to let it leave. Nathaniel crouched down beside her. "You did something really important," he told her. "You saw something broken and small, and instead of walking past it, you stopped. A lot of grown-ups forget how to do that. I forgot how to do that for a long time." Sophia looked up at him, still watching the empty sky where Biscuit had disappeared. "You gotta be soft," she reminded him, as though this were simply the most obvious truth in the world. "I know," Nathaniel said, smiling. "I'm working on remembering that. Every day." In the weeks that followed, the changes rippled outward in ways no one at the estate could have fully anticipated. The Diane Cross Foundation grew, funding childcare grants for dozens of working parents across the city within its first quarter alone. Nathaniel began arriving to work meetings a little later and leaving a little earlier, making room in his relentless schedule for the small, unglamorous rituals that had once seemed like weakness and now felt like the truest measure of his strength. Dinners with the household staff, morning walks through the garden, a standing Sunday tradition of feeding the birds that gathered near the fountain, in honor of a mother he'd finally allowed himself to grieve properly, and a small girl who'd reminded him how. The story of Nathaniel Cross and the injured pigeon never made headlines. It was never meant to. It was simply one quiet garden, one broken wing, and one small child too young to know that grown-ups had forgotten how to stop and help, and brave enough, without even realizing it, to remind one that he hadn't forgotten forever. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness don't just heal what's broken in front of us. They heal something we didn't even know was still broken inside ourselves. If this story touched your heart even a little, I'd be so grateful if you hit that like button, subscribed for more stories just like this one, and shared it with someone who might need a little reminder today that kindness, real, quiet, unglamorous kindness, still changes everything. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.